Okay, brilliant. Alright, let's get started. Just get it up. Okay. Okay, brilliant. Let's get started. Firstly, can one panel? Awesome, so time filming. Great. Okay, welcome everyone to round 4. Yay. What motion are we debating?
Oscars.
Oh, fuck yes. Great news. The first one up on filmmakers. Yeah, that's awesome. Okay, cool. What motion did we go?
We did the third one.
Synthetic performance? Yep. Yeah, did you guys video CCP?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Great. Alright, let's do a name pronoun round. My name is Bella. I'm going to be the chair. My pronoun is she, her. I have 2 panels with me today.
Your first up. My name's Alex. He, him.
I'm Isaac, and pronouns are fine, good luck to all teams.
Awesome. UNSW.
I'm Abhinav, I'm first app, my name is she, her.
Cool.
Zarah, second app, she, her.
No third.
Great. And then you?
First name, Mackenna, she, her, she, they.
Second name, Phoebe, she, her.
Third name, Ben, he, him.
Awesome. Okay, thanks everyone. We'll use time to cap the please for yourselves. Without delay, first round. Yeah, stand them on the table, I recommend.
What have we moved?
Don't worry about it. Don't worry about it.
Is that audible?
Yes.
Sorry.
I'm going to be doing 2 things in my speech today. Firstly, on why existing change in the Academy is insufficient for getting change for Black filmmakers. And secondly, on how, on our side of the house, we get internal change in the Academy and why that's important, things like that. So onto my first argument. So we think that the claim from the negative team will be on their side of the house, they will have more Black awards and more Black winners. However, what we'll prove in this claim is that it's insufficient, not only insufficient, but also bad. And on our side of the house, why the existing change is insufficient. Firstly, we think that it's insufficient because you have a higher barrier to winning an Oscar as a Black filmmaker. And this is for a number of reasons. Firstly, because of the composition of the Academy, as we know from the info slide. And this happens for a few reasons. Firstly, because the majority of the Academy is white people and therefore have like an unconscious bias. Secondly, because members have lifelong membership. This is generally because once someone is recognized by the Academy, it's very difficult to get kicked out of the Academy unless someone is like extremely negative in a way. And therefore, generally people are welcomed for life, and that means the Academy members are often old and white in particular, rather than just being like, young, white people. Secondly, we think that external to the Academy, on this other level, white filmmakers also have structural advantages on how it's easier for them to get into the filmmaker over Black filmmakers. This looks like white people being more likely to be accepted into institutions such as Juilliard, being more likely to have larger budgets, being more able to be accepted during pitches, and more likely to have connections in the movie industry as a result of just where they exist in society. We think that in the status quo, we have seen some change kind of in the Oscars and how it's advanced Black people, but we think that this is very limited and not sufficient in the way it could be. This is because of the analysis I've given you above. But it also means that the change that we do get is generally superficial and tokenistic. This is because the way the Academy is set up, it's non-transparent, and it means that it's hidden behind a wall and it's never actually criticized. The Academy kind of keeps getting away with it. We see things like the Academy will be criticized for institutional racism, and then it'll be talked about for like a month, and then people forget, and then it happens again, and it happens again. Like, this kind of looks like tokenistic things, like giving one like black actor in like every like 20 that are nominated an award. We also think that generally with the Oscars, like, because it's kind of like subjective, they can just plead that like it's subjective art and then not like, it's easy to get away with bias in something that's less like measurable. Okay, now on to why our side gets internal change on the Academy and why this is the only mechanism to do so in like the world of the Oscars. Firstly, we think that successful black filmmakers in general have likely been recognised by the Academy already in their life, either through a win or multiple nominations, and are part of the select few who have overcome like all of the like institutional barriers that we've like set up before. This looks like people like Spike Lee and stuff. We think that as a result of these successful black filmmakers who like are generally known to the public, this will do a few things. Firstly, we think it'll capture the general attention of the public as what like we perceive to be adored public figures by like the general public. It'll also make like negative media coverage for the Academy and the Oscars in a way that's more permanent. We think this is because like it'll force the Academy to make changes in a way that's unique to this change, and that they're facing bad optics, bad media attention from what is multiple and successful black actors, rather than someone that like hasn't like won an award and is like speaking up against the Academy. We think this was like massive names in the movie industry who are then like lobbying for change. We think that the way this like weighs in the debate is that we get more permanent change. This looks like invisible versus like visible change. Currently the way it's set up, it's all like invisible and behind closed doors, versus this like very vivid, like in the public eye, visible. People can see that this is something that successful black filmmakers are literally doing. We also think that as a result of like our mechanism, there is existing backlash towards the Oscars that we can see in the status quo that then can be mobilized and made more permanent behind like more tangible change. So what do we think that these changes will look like? Firstly, we think that it's likely that the Academy will make decisions more transparent. This could look like, you know, like more sponsorships for black people and stuff like that. Yeah. And then why do we think that this change is important? Firstly, we think that the Oscars, despite its flaws, is the most recognized film award despite its like structural issues of racism, and we think that it is like an extremely like important thing for future success. And like the way that like when getting Oscars and Academy like attention, it will lead to people being paid more and having future opportunities. We also think that there is a cultural importance of the Oscars and of like how it makes film more important and like a bigger influence. It has like an influence on like movies that are successful and that are like nominated and awarded generally have an influence on the movie industry at large, but also just like society itself in the fact that like people absorb a lot of their values through the art they consume and stuff like that. We think that even if this change like literally does not occur, which like we've given you set out pretty well how it does, we think that these successful black filmmakers have a principled obligation to enact this change, and we think this is for a couple of reasons. Firstly, it's because they're standing up an oppressive industry, an oppressive institution that has had like a very large and long history of being oppressive. Like that Academy has existed for hundreds of years. We also think that these actors have a future obligation to black filmmakers, like in the future, whose success is contingent on the Academy, and therefore like should enact the most possible change they think they can for black filmmakers to win in the future. So for those reasons, I'm proud to affirm.
Great, thank you so much for that speaking for their speech, and I now welcome our first native.
the Oscars isn't good enough in the status quo, but they proposed no actual way to get that change. Maybe the Oscars can sponsor more black movies is the only reference we actually hear to how they might get changed long term. What we tell you under our side is we are on a positive trajectory, and having people of colour and black filmmakers within the Academy is actually on a really positive trajectory, and because of these easy mechanisms of sponsorship listed in the info slide, there is really good ways to call for change and make sure that the Oscars is able to be more representative and is able to give like adequate awards where they're deserved. We think that's actually a really clear mechanism for change that happens internally, as opposed to some idea of opting out without any reason to why that's actually going to make a difference long term, or what that difference would even look like. Okay, 3 things I'm going to do in this speech. Firstly, I'm going to talk about why we think black filmmakers can make better change from within. Secondly, I'm going to tell you why limited media coverage will mean that opting out won't do anything versus the positive trajectory that we offer you. And thirdly, I'm going to talk about why we think these successful black filmmakers actually just deserve respect in and of themselves and deserve that recognition, so ought not be obligated to opt out. Okay, firstly on why we think black filmmakers can make better change within. Note there are 2 points here. Firstly, about how we get current voting in a really good way for these films, and secondly, how future voting we get for even better change. A little bit of analysis here on what the selection process looks like before we begin that. We think these awards work by a lot of networking, discussion, and also importance to the cultural relevance of a film. Networking means that members of the Academy are meeting up with one another and are meeting up with the filmmakers and the producers, going to pre-screenings, offer things like dinners and conversations, and that's a really important part of the discussion of what these films look like. And noting here with this discussion, that means votes don't happen in a vacuum where every individual person just decides what film they like. Actually, these Academy people on the board are discussing with one another, and that gives a specific platform for black people in the conversation, in the room, to bring up new art, and that's really important. And thirdly, we want to note that we think cultural relevance is actually quite important to a film being nominated. For example, here, we know that Barbie was really big within pop culture, was really big and commercialised, but didn't actually translate into a lot of Oscars being won, because what actually matters quite a bit to these Oscar sort of committees is about a film being artsy, more like La La Land, or having more relevance to like a cultural conversation or something like that. We know that that's more likely to be brought up and promoted by black filmmakers within this region. Okay, so how does this specifically engage with how current voting is likely to get better? Firstly, we think as established because of the discussion and networking effect that actually happens in the creation of who gets these awards, we think that means that these black filmmakers actually have a lot of power to shape conversations. 3 ways they do this. Firstly, they're able to discuss with other Academy members, bringing up small black films, bringing up this sort of other speculative types of films they might not have seen, which means they're more likely to get heard about generally. Secondly, we think they're able to organise networking events and actually invite people to see those films. Again, that boosts the profile in a really meaningful way. And thirdly, we think they can talk about these films in context. Because they have more lived experience, they are more likely to be able to explain why this film is quite important. We know that particularly when there is backlash, people are likely to be sensitive and try and listen to these Black Academy perspectives, and be likely to see the cultural relevance of that, to note how in setup we explain why that is important to nomination. What this means is, and the reason that this works so successfully is because these black filmmakers within the topic are specifically successful. They do have authority over what a good film looks like, and they're able to lend that authority when they promote a film and tie their name to it, sort of promoting it. We know the fact here, Jordan Peele has a lot of power to do things like that. This is the sort of example that could happen to, even if it's not a massive amount, there are still 19%. That is still a lot of people who can start those conversations in a way that they wouldn't happen if they weren't internally there. What does this mean? It means that films are actually in the conversation where they wouldn't otherwise be, and do have more relevance and explanation of why they're culturally important, given that that's a reason they might be nominated, and they're seen as more relevant and brought up more. Okay, that means in this current time, these films that are likely to be made by black filmmakers, or are more likely to be relevant to people of colour, are more likely to be voted for, are more likely to be heard about and have a higher profile. That's really important. Furthermore, we tell you secondly here, that black filmmakers can make better change within by making future voting better through the simple mechanism listed in the info slide about being able to nominate more people themselves. This means they're lending their authority not only to films that get nominated now, but to people who are able to join this Academy and make change progressively into the future. We think they're likely to recognise a lot of the art of other black creators as really important. They're more likely to network within these communities and know them, and also probably care about the sort of affirmative action and making sure that there are black people within this industry particularly. We also note that the nomination doesn't happen without black actors here, because often, like these white older actors that actors wanted to characterise do have more bias and watch less black films and are also likely to see these as not as commercialised, not come up as often when they're not in those sort of conversations. Okay, what's the impact of this? Is it means that like black filmmakers who are currently successful are able to lend their authority, get more films in the short term, but also get more people on that voting board into the long term, which changes the makeup of the Academy and actually gets the change that we really want in this debate. Note this is really important, this whole point is really important. We care about this because we think black films, writers and actors deserve nominations, deserve recognition for the type of art that they are. They deserve legitimacy as stories and deserve legitimacy as creators, and also they're more likely to get success as people of colour when these films are likely to be more successful because people know they won an Oscar or things like that and get hyped through the nomination process. That's really important. Okay, let's talk here about the why limited media coverage, moving to the second point, won't actually be sufficient. We think opting out won't actually generate any sufficient change because the public doesn't actually currently have a really good perception of who is in the Academy. I don't think you could really name people who are in this Academy, and while a couple might be celebrities, the majority of them are just quite successful filmmakers or writers that we don't actually know the names of. So it's more likely to be a sort of hidden group that people don't necessarily know about. Even if there is public outcry because it hits the media that someone really famous has opted out, we think this is inherently going to be short term. That's because media attention spans are really limited. So this will only last for like one sort of news cycle as that news media looks to the next like big thing to talk about. And instead, people quickly disappears from their frame of vision. They heard that there was an outcry, the Oscars were really bad, but then the next 6, 10 months, a year goes by, they've forgotten about that, and it won't continue to come up as an important topic. This means that we lose that ability to actually get change. Under our side, what I've already told you and clearly mechanized is that we are on a positive trajectory. 81% is not great, but I tell you it's probably far better than what it's been in the past. And we can only continue to make it better by ensuring we still have black people within the industry who are able to recommend other people, recommend black films, and make it far better. The comparative under-affirmative is that there are no black people within this organisation. There is far less attention for these sort of movies and films, and we think that's really, really damaging in both the short term and the long term. Finally, on this point of why we think these filmmakers deserve respect in and of themselves, we think that these people are an important stakeholder here, given they're under an obligation to opt out under the affirmative team's side. We think this is quite unfair, considering the fact that this is a really important form of recognition for them, having struggled against a really difficult system. This is personal validation, not necessarily like in the media, but a personal validation that your work is actually really meaningful, is really good, from experts and people within the community. We think that's valuable in and of itself because these people have put a lot of effort into becoming really good within their field and have specifically struggled in that aspect because of how white-dominated that field tends to be. And we think it's an inherent good that they're able to continue to capitalise on their sort of success and feel recognised for that. It's also really good to have role models in society and to continue to allow these actors to keep networking. For all those reasons, we think our side is far better.
Great, thanks so much for that speech, and I now welcome the second affirmative.
The opposition here is trying to paint a picture that there is enough change, it's great. But we think this is just like empirically untrue. How can you say there's enough change when every single year you're adding up to 1,000 members and still the percentage of white people in the Academy is 81%, despite there have been like a push for we're not racist, but super fair, we've been in it's been 20 years, we're in 2024, and yet we're still in this thing. And I think that point is an indicative of how institutionally racist the Academy is, how oppressive it is, and the only way that we can actually get successful change is by disruptive behaviour, such as opting out. So far in this debate, there are a few main pushes well, do these successful black filmmakers achieve more change and are able to be more successful in changing the academy within or outside? And so before I get into that, I would just like to push up some data about how this still a principle, how this is still a principled behaviour to opt out, right? Because as I told you, this is institutionally racist, an oppressive institution which doesn't is incapable of recognising black filmmakers at the same standard that they try to do with their white friends and colleagues and family friends, right? So we think it's just principled to try to opt out of this institution at the point that it's failed to make enough significant change. Secondly, we think this would work to disrupt the institution and the reputation it does in a substantive way, which I'll get into in my later into the later issues. So firstly, it's this thing about there's enough sufficient change because of because black filmmakers can just network and push up films. So we have several responses to this. Firstly, I'd like to say is what is this not the status quo? We don't think successful black filmmakers currently are not trying to help people. But the reason why we don't see enough significant change, where we don't see the percentages changing, is because of the fact there are these structural issues that we've told you at first as to why the academy still remains to be largely white dominated and not recognizing black filmmakers. And I'll repeat to you what those are, right? So firstly, we've told you you need to have two supporters, and the fact remains even if you have those successful black filmmakers doing this, they are in a minority, right? So it means the other 81% white people in the academy are also supporting people to join the academy every single year. So at the end of this, even if black filmmakers are trying so hard to push in other black filmmakers into the academy, what remains is you still have a large, predominant, disproportionate amount of white people in the academy, which it limits your ability to fully recognize black films and black filmmakers, right? And so, what do we think you're able to achieve on the our side of the comparative when you have an opt-out, right? You're asking for aggressive change in the institution, which could look like something saying, actually we'll make a structural adjustment where it's maybe you only have one supporter for it, or you have giving them a low threshold to enter because you recognize the fact they didn't go to school. They're not besties with everyone in the institution. They don't have those connections that white filmmakers just inherently have because of their superior racial position in society, right? Secondly, they tried to say it's you can't generate enough acclaim outside the institution because people like artsy things. And we think this is part of the problem, right? People are able to push away the fact that the academy isn't doing enough in combating racism under the word artsy. I'm sorry, this black filmmaker wasn't artsy or cinematography, didn't have the cinematography that white people want, right? Because this goes into the third issue, which is to say black filmmakers will be inherently presenting black issues, whether it's explicitly because they're trying to draw from their own life, or implicitly because that's just their own direction when they try bring in their own perspectives on life, right? And we think the reason why these films aren't ever going to be appreciated at the same level that white filmmakers' films are is because they cannot, the 81% white majority are not able to resound with those issues to the same way that black filmmakers and people in this academy are, right? And this comes down to the fact that it's still largely white and they're still unable to hear those voices, right? So we think you're not actually getting the change that you want. We think you're able to push these issues away, and it comes down to again how the composition is and how they're unable to change and actually make the adjustments you need to allow black people to enter, right? So we don't think you can do this. And fourthly, they try to say you can just network and just talk about these films. And so we'd like to say, fourthly, this is not exclusive to doing it within the academy forum, right? Just because a successful black filmmaker has opted out because they've said this institution is racist does not mean that no one no longer respects their film artistry, their position in society, and the fact that they build a reputation and acclaim, right? They are still recognized as a powerful filmmaker, and that is why their opting out is going to be effective, right? Because they still have a voice and a position of authority to say these are good films, and they don't have to do it whilst they have a membership in the academy, right? It is they're still able to speak on these films, they're still able to promote it, and rather than we think they would be able to weaponize and mobilize the fact that they have that publicity, that public publicity of opting out to actually generate more discourse on these issues, to point out the structural issues that they are facing that are often hidden by terms it wasn't artsy enough, or it was actually all behind closed doors. The fact that they are these little you have to network and you have to have connections within the academy to even be recognized, and having a good film isn't enough. Points to another issue as to why the academy as it stands now is not going to be able to sufficiently change or change fast enough. We don't think it's sufficient to say we're willing to wait another 30 years for there to be maybe 60% white people and 40% black people. Why do we have to discount and not credit these these black filmmakers that are coming out now and in the future for those issues. And fifthly, they tried to say like, oh, opting out is just not going to be not that successful because it won't gain enough traction. So to this we have a few responses. Firstly is to say, opting out is unprecedented in the Academy, at least in recent times, in recent memory. It is not like, oh, like, you know, there was this really good film, Selma, that was like out and they didn't get an award, they were only nominated and they didn't get an award. That's pretty sucky. Like that runs for a few cycles of media. No, they are opting out of a historically prestigious institution. That is going to generate a lot of media attention. And their suggestion as to say that they're not known is incredibly untrue. Everyone's like, oh my god, did you watch the Oscars? Did you hear that speech? Like, it is very popular. It is in people's memories. People know these films, and we think they are actually like recognized, even if not by the general public, like every single person. There are people who enjoy films. There are people who like watch Oscars, and they're the ones who have the most influence on the thing. So we think it's untrue to say that they won't have a lot of media attention. Rather, we think they have these reasons, as in it is unprecedented firstly. Secondly, they are successful black filmmakers. And thirdly, as to say, like, it is making a structural point and pointing out the issues in the institution. It would generate a lot of coverage and would give them a bigger platform to do the level of networking that they've so talked about, where they can point to the films that have recently come out and haven't received proper attention, right? So we think for these reasons, their mechanisms as to say, like, oh, you can just do it within the institution, fall out and are not as strong as the ability to like actually draw public and attention within the Academy. Because even within the Academy, people aren't recognizing their own unconscious bias when they're saying this, right? Because you're still within that bubble. So we think like stepping out and saying, checking all their friends who are like white filmmakers and being like, you were sort of part of the issue. Can you reflect on how you might have like been biased against this film because it wasn't an issue that necessarily hit home for you because you didn't experience like racism growing up, right? So it's like a call out for everyone in the institution and outside, and we think that's a very like important thing. So we think A, that they're able to make more change outside. Secondly, we think like operating within this institution, which has been unable to successfully change for so long, is just principally incorrect and like is unable to make change at the same level, right? So for these reasons, we see that like this is not only the principal change, we see this is the most effective way to get structural change. And even if you weren't able to like change the Academy, we think this would leave like a pretty significant stain on the Academy as to diminish their revenue and as to point out as these issues and generate further discourse as to how this can be changed or possibly shift the attention from maybe not the Academy being the centre of the artsy world. And for these reasons, we are proud to affirm.
Great, thank you so much for that speech, and now welcome second negative.
Let's consider the principle of what Affirmative is advocating for in a different light for a second. It would be like telling women that because they're underrepresented at the high levels of politics, they should completely remove themselves from the equation and not even bother running for election and just post on Twitter instead. Panel, change from the outside the wall garden will never be as fast or impactful. Don't let the opposition regress the standing of black filmmakers within this industry and academy. Two issues to discuss in this speech. Firstly, how this opt-out will be responded to by society and rewarded the Academy, and secondly, on the principal obligations of black filmmakers. First, let's look at its response. At first, we hear that there's been some change, but it's tokenistic or invisible, and that this is because the Academy is behind the wall, non-transparent, and also people and media at large have short attention spans, and discourse around this only tends to last about a month. I think opposition's own analysis works against them here, right? Because first, on their side, people still have a short attention span. I think they fail to prove that they actually get more attention from people, right? They tell you that they're going to get more attention because these black filmmakers are so beloved. In the existing status quo, when these beloved black filmmakers post things like Oscars so white or outrage the fact that fellow people like didn't get nominated, yes, you see like a few weeks of discussion on Twitter, it's pretty limited and it has almost zero impact. And that's because the same reason they gave you, the fact that the Academy is a conservative, predominantly white institution that does not like to come out and do like affirmative action and such because it doesn't like to be involved in political agendas. I think many institutions like that, which can be compared to like in the sporting world, like FIFA, don't want to be allied with particular like political movements and therefore just silent as a whole and sort of operate as an institution rather than like an advocacy group. For that reason, I think they're very unlikely to even get response from the Academy in the first place in any way other than sort of invisible changes or tokenistic changes that they tell you exist on the outside anyways. But also, also, on people's attention spans, I simply think all you're going to get is a few major names, like say Jordan Peele, opting out of the academy, and then outrage on Twitter being like, from his fans, like, oh, we're so annoyed that this happened, it's so unfair. But I actually think that the average citizen's response, who's not super involved in the arts, and just when Oscars roll around, look to see who's nominated, I think their response will be a little bit different. And I think what that response is going to look like is a bit of an internal push away from this idea of like black filmmakers seeming angry, right? Let's look at the unconscious biases that a lot of people hold in our society. It's that black people are too angry and they're not engaging respectively in politics in the right way, right? I think that when black filmmakers come out and say that they're being done unjustly with this academy, a lot of people's immediate response, who do not understand how racist this institution is going to be that these are just people complaining because they're not getting recognition, right? Oh, you think your film was good and should have won an Oscar, like you're just complaining, your film wasn't that good. I think you actually get a bit of backlash from people who feel like the institution that they admire is being attacked. So in that way, I think you're just unlikely to get the level of media discourse and actual change that they're trying to discuss. Consider the fact that the Oscars So White campaign, it was like a small niche subset of Twitter that was like really supporting that, but for the most part it died out and created no real change. Under First Amendment, we also hear that we're going to mobilise existing backlash and make it more permanent, and this specific permanent change we're talking about is getting more sponsorships for black people. This is literally just like a slower version of our case, right? They're going to say opt out, and then we're going to somehow mobilise the media and mobilise people's short attention spans, and they're going to get more sponsorships, and then they're going to become more part of the institution. I think it's just a very circuitous way of achieving what we can already do by using the existing black filmmakers who are already within the academy who sponsor more people, right? It's much easier, and they literally tell you that at second affirmative that white people in the academy only intend to promote or nominate white people, right? That was their literal mechanism to why we're not getting change. I think if you then tell all of the black filmmakers that are already in the academy to remove themselves from the equation, you're even less likely to get sponsorships, because by their own analysis, only black people are going to sponsor more black people. Also, they tell you that on second affirmative, people can still network and promote their films, and that's not an exclusive benefit to our side. I disagree because they hold no voting power in the academy. If you're opting out, you now have to rely on white people to validate your work. If you actually want critical acclaim and recognition in the Oscars or other important award shows, you have to rely on your white peers to tell you that your work is good enough, as opposed to you having a voting block in the academy. Yes, for instance, maybe not as good as it should be, but there's still enough power to affect change in the academy. It's enough power to say, I think Jordan Peele's movie is really, really good and should be nominated, and it's more likely to affect change in that way. We should not tell black people in this day and age that white people can actually validate their work, and that because they're in a racist institution, they should just absolve themselves from the situation entirely. I think even if option can prove to you that they are able to mobilise media attention, people's attention spans, and create some kind of outrage and force the academy, which literally never responds to this kind of public outrage in a serious manner, to actually create effective change and have more sponsorships or change those sponsorships work. I think even if they manage to achieve that in, say, 5 years down the track of this opt-out system, that is too great a harm. 5 years of having no major successful black filmmakers in the academy able to nominate important work, able to make more black people within the academy, is a significant harm. That is 5 years of predominantly white films being nominated, because as they tell you, only black people can really understand the nuance of these films. That is 5 years of average citizens seeing films that are nominated and creating more unconscious bias tells them that white films or arts films are actually the better, more critically acclaimed films. 5 years of people going to the cinema and seeing a really good black film and not seeing it get any nominations, and because they're not actually that across how this whole system is working, just thinking that's because those films aren't as good, aren't as critically recognised by people who really know their stuff in the industry, not because people are opting out of the system. On to this second point then on principled obligation. First, I'm going to tell you that black people should opt out of these issues inherently racist. Let's follow this logic through to its actual conclusion. Our political system is also historically and continually racist. So is our legal system and our courts. So is higher education. And yes, so is the film industry. But the answer to dealing with these racist institutions and this continual racism is not to shame black people for still wanting to act as success and the highest form of recognition. The answer is not to tell black filmmakers that they are morally corrupt or against their principled obligation because they want to still get critical acclaim for a film they put a lot of work into. If you dedicate your life to studying film and to appreciating the art and putting time and money and effort into rallying people to get around this film, and then you're told that you're going into a principled obligation to black people because you want to actually win an Oscar for this film because of the sheer amount of effort you put in because you deserve that Oscar, I think that's really disrespectful to people who put that work in. I think it's equivalent to, say, telling black people they shouldn't run a particular lecture because that lecture is historically racist, right? You obviously get more change when you're inside this walled garden. when you sit there in the actual echelons of like power, when you have a voting bloc, as opposed to just sitting on Twitter and saying it's so unfair in this film, right? Because that is the actual comparative debate. The comparative is Jordan Peele in the Academy sponsoring more black filmmakers to join it, nominating important films, holding this like persuading a voting bloc, versus Jordan Peele on Twitter saying this film was really good, it's so exciting to get nominated by white peers who are the only ones who now exist in this academy, okay? That is the distinction in this debate. Our side tells black people we are making slow change, we should speed this change up. It's appropriate now to start sponsoring more and more black people. It's appropriate now to hold more networking events and to actually gain critical acclaim, because as we tell you, when you get critical acclaim, that then spurs like popular support. So the fact that Parasite wasn't necessarily that commercially successful on first release, wasn't that well known by Western audiences, then gained an Oscar and is now always referred to as being like one of the most amazing films of the 21st century, right? That just demonstrates to you the power of the Oscars. Or the fact that Oppenheimer versus Barbie, Oppenheimer was significantly less commercially successful and was way more successful at the Oscars because because the director has so much more power than that institution. If you want to actually gain the critical acclaim and also noting the most of people supply or insert the opinions of those at the top stands as opposed to their own. Like if you see that the Academy is saying this is the best film, you as someone who's not studying film is going to agree with that and just take it as the better opinion. So it's so important to get that critical acclaim. We should never tell black people that it's inappropriate for them to actually want to actually have success in their life for the hard work they put into their job.
Great, thank you so much for that speech, and I now welcome the third affirmative.
The actor in this motion is a successful black filmmaker. What this likely means is that they've probably won Academy Awards, they've probably done something to get into the Academy in the first instance. So I think all of their claims on why these filmmakers' films will not be watched just fall out of a debate. Simple reasons for this. First, the public already buys into a lot of their films and often likes the films that they have. Two, they have name recognition that is derived from the fact that they've won these Oscars in and of itself. But three, if you do this, you just probably get a lot more attention on the filmmaker itself. I'll flip this later and prove why their case just doesn't work. The first claim here is you have better change within, and the mechanism they give for this is selection and networking. But I have 6 responses that will talk about why this is incredibly hard to do this. First, the space for networking itself is incredibly limited within the Academy. First, you as a filmmaker have other commitments, stuff like making a film in and of itself, stuff like producing. But secondly, it's just empirically true that the Academy only meets twice a year. They meet on very limited instances, therefore it's unclear how much power you actually have to shape the agenda. But secondly, and I think this is incredibly important, often black filmmakers feel out of place within these discussions, and they self-select out of these meetings. Spike Lee famously doesn't go to these Academy meetings, and the simple reason is that when you as a black person are in a room full of white people and people that don't look like you, you just feel out of place. But thirdly, leadership structures are still white. The reason for this is the mechanism that we tell you at first. These are people that are members for life, and these are the people that set the agenda. Fourthly, there's a cap on the amount of space. White films are also discussed, but the way in here is just that there are more of these white films that are likely to be nominated because you just have more of a general white populace. But I think secondly, there are more white filmmakers who also have the power to nominate. So it's unclear why you get a comparative shift in the amount of black filmmakers that are being represented, because in order for their case to get changed, you need an increase in a proportion of black filmmakers relative to white filmmakers. But all of the mechanisms we tell you at first is why you have even more white filmmakers, and this percentage will go down. The fact that they have structural connections and networks, the fact that they're more likely to have gotten into places like Juilliard, the fact that they have existing connections with these Oscar members. So if those connections do exist, it's just far more justifiable for a white filmmaker to nominate even more white filmmakers, therefore the proportion gets even more skewed. But I think fifthly, films that are nominated are often influenced by other things in the run-up to the Oscars. This looks like film critics and reviews who are likely to be white because of the structural advantage reasoning we give at first. Secondly, they're influenced by other film festivals and how films do at these festivals. The European film circuit is famously non-black, there's literally zero representation there. But thirdly, you have domestic critics associations that are often white because of the stuff that we tell you at first in terms of analysis, in terms of advantage. So I think at the point at which the discourse is already generated because of these mechanisms and how they're influenced in the run to the Oscar, it becomes incredibly hard for you as a black filmmaker to actually get your stuff onto the agenda in the first instance. But I think fifthly, and most importantly, they make a fatal error at first. They say black filmmakers have to put their films in context. So what this means then is that they have to cater to the white gaze. So even if you get change, this is tokenistic. It doesn't recognize black art for what it actually is. It recognizes black art for what it is relative to the white gaze, in the context of the white gaze. This is the literal, this is the language that the Oscars use to, one, justify excluding black films, but two, just place a disproportionate burden on these black filmmakers to get that recognition in the first place. So I think the comparative then is a few things. First, even if they do opt out, this is comparatively better. Because let's think about it, and the simple reason for this is threefold. First, because of the principal obligation that we tell you at first. The fact that this is a historically oppressive institution that does these terrible things. But secondly, you probably make films not just to earn money, you make films to make art and put out messaging that resonates with you. So even if it's not as critically successful, and we bite the bullet on that, the fact that you have more of a cultural appreciation for your specific art, as opposed to having to put it in a specific context for the white gaze, for the larger audience. So what this means then is that the people that you care about, the communities that you care about, the films that you make for that specific community are likely to watch and internalize it a lot better, as opposed to the general white gaze that they have to cater to on the SF House by putting it in context. But that's not true because of my introduction. First, the fact that the public probably already recognizes you as a successful black filmmaker. But secondly, you just get a shit ton of media attention. Their responses here are, first, the media is short term and this is bad. But first, this is unprecedented, as Zarah tells you, at the point at which multiple black successful filmmakers, who the public generally loves and adores because of their movies, opt out of a historically oppressive institution that is already facing backlash. One, this just looks terrible for the Oscars in terms of this looks terrible for the Oscars because they already have racist accusations of them being racist. But two, there are existing trends in the film industry, stuff like the SAG-AFTRA strike that got a shit ton of media attention just by the virtue of the fact that there were multiple different people that actually did this. But three, they say that you're an unknown, but then they use examples of people like Jordan Poole. The examples you gave are Spike Lee. These are clearly people with large amounts of influence. It's unclear why they have no power to shape the media. But fourthly, even if they don't have any influence, the fact that all of them are doing this as a collective means that you likely get this attention. But I think the impact of this is a few things. First, the films of these filmmakers themselves probably get a shit ton of attention. In that, the fact that these filmmakers have opted out of the Oscars probably means that one, more people are likely to, if they didn't know them before, watch these films, but two, engage with the discourse in a lot healthier of a manner. But let's flip this explicitly in terms of why media attention and public attention is a lot greater. Firstly, on their side of the house, they're able to do this behind closed doors, as we tell you at first. At that point, specifically, all of the bias mechanisms that we tell you at first are able to be weaponized. In that, the Oscars are able to do stuff like justify the fact that it wasn't put in context enough, or it wasn't artistic enough, stuff like that. But secondly, the attention they get is just moves away a lot quicker because one, you just don't have as much of a radical step because this attention is just a rehashing the existing backlash that exists. We go one step further in that we use that existing backlash, but we do this incredibly radical thing, and that is how you get more media attention. But three, I think there's just a public incentive for the media to cover this, and this is such a prestigious award, and big prominent black filmmakers are using existing backlash and then opting out, just have a general incentive to cover it. What change does this then look like? I think firstly, you force the Oscars' hand in terms of making sponsorship processes easier. Secondly, maybe something like a quota, maybe just making it easier for black filmmakers. But three, I think it's just much more likely that you get the actual change in terms of having stuff like transparent decision making, having stuff like due checks and balances that we tell you at first. And the reason for this is because a lot of the backlash that exists in the status quo is centered around the fact that the Oscars are incredibly non-transparent, incredibly able to be behind closed doors, and that is necessarily bad. So I think just on the level of change, one, we probably get better change in terms of actually getting that change. But secondly, it's unclear why these black filmmakers are not welcomed back into the academy, or more and because of all of the changes, you just get more black filmmakers into the academy. And the reason for this is they were accepted in the first place. Therefore, it's probably terrible for them to opt out and not be let in again when these changes do happen. So I think this in and of itself is quite effective. But even if they don't get any change and they just opt out, this is one, good because it's a historically oppressive institution. Two, you still probably get some amount of recognition. But three, as we've proven to you, the fact that you probably care more than just critical acclaim or like mass media attention, and you have the cater for public taste on their side of the house. The communities that actually appreciate your art for what it is, and like the actual messaging behind the art, as opposed to a diluted version that caters to the white audiences that exist in the academy. For all of those reasons, I oppose.
Cool. Thanks so much for that speech. And now welcome to the negative to the podium.
We only hear it then at near the end of third affirmative what they actually want the Oscars to do. Because while second affirmative said, oh, we should move away from the Oscars and things like that, that would be great, the side affirmative team knows that the Oscars have a lot of attention and that it is important for films to be in the Oscars, and that has a big impact on the culture. So the thing that affirmative team then wants is something like increased transparency and increased quotas. But these changes are so much harder to get and so much more politically unpalatable that the kind of boycott and the pressure that they hope to create is never going to create the kind of structural change to the Oscars voting process. We provided a much surer mechanism to make sure black films get recognition that is changed with inside, noting that these creators, these filmmakers have the ability to enact this change and do this. That is more realistic, that ensures people get these things. First point, I'll quickly deal with this principle and why we conclusively win it. Secondly, how we are able to get change within and how filmmakers can do this. And secondly, thirdly, how their boycott does not have the impacts they wish to do and achieve things in circuitous routes. Firstly, on this principle, I think Phoebe just responds to this completely right. You know, women should not have to opt out of politics because it is structurally bad. And we tell you at Mackenna positive reasons why you deserve recognition, right? Black filmmakers have struggled, they have fought the system, they deserve to be recognized by peers and things like this. They deserve the sense of prestige that comes from other members of the community. Sure, it is a racist community, but it's a community you still value, right? It's people whose art you probably respect. Maybe it's from a different perspective, but you still respect Spielberg for what he's able to do, even if he's white. Filmmakers deserve this kind of recognition and priority. We conclusively win this principle. And even if we do not win this principle, I think the outcomes for the black film industry and black people as a whole are more important than individual actors and things like this. Cool. Let's talk about the change within. The idea from them here is that you will not be able to take change within because white people can't be convinced and they're so racist. And then we hear a bunch of mechanisms in third affirmative why you are unable to convince other people because you feel out of place and things like this. But I just want to re-establish what our burden is here, right? We don't have to show that black filmmakers have some magical ability to convert all white people. We show that them being in the room has an impact and is able to catalyze and start conversations. Because I think things like cultural respect and the conversation is something that is very non-linear, right? Just suggesting or bringing up a new movie creates snowball effects and other people have to talk about it and things like this. So they don't have to be a large proportion of this body to be able to have an impact on the conversation and these networking. What other ideas do we get from them? We get the idea that there's limited space and you have other commitments. A lot of these people are retired, right? You're in the academy once you've done your major films and you're successful and things like this. Obviously there are some people who are still making films, but a lot of people, they are retired and doing things. They bring an idea about you feel out of place in a room full of white people. Sure, this is the case, but also you are talking, you still are able to interact with these people, and they are your peers in terms of filmmakers, right? You do have some connection with them in terms of the art form and the craft. They're probably people you have worked with throughout your career. So yes, it is uncomfortable, you have some ability to do this. this. They also talk about leadership structure and things like this. But while there are certain hierarchies within the Oscars, at the end of the day, it is a vote, right? It is people as a general who you convince. There isn't some lead person of the Oscars who's officially designated. That means if you're able to appeal to certain factions within this voting party, certain, say, of this 81% of white people who may be receptive, you can start changing and things like that, right? So all the mechanisms that they say that white people will also present films and things like this, I think ignore the fact that you still have an influence. Their comparative is that there is no black person in this room, and that is much less likely for these films to be talked about, which means that Moonlight probably doesn't get an Oscars nomination or something like this. Get Out doesn't get recommended just because they aren't talking about things like this. The other thing I think is important to stress on our case here is that so the other point that we bring up the point that you can sponsor people and get new people into the academy. They say that won't happen because you need 2 people to sponsor. I think sponsoring new people is the exact kind of change that is very easy for the Oscars to do. Why? Because it looks great on statistics, right? You can say the Oscars have, a voting board that is 40% black or something like that. You can easily point to it as a tokenistic and easy change. You do not have to rewrite the rules of voting like they suggest, and I'll get onto in the next point and things like that. It makes you seem like you're doing actions. That is the exact kind of change that we would need, and the exact kind of change that we are able to get under our side of the house. The final idea they get under this point from Third Affirmative is that it tokenizes black films and that you shouldn't have to pander to other to white people. And so the idea here from Third Affirmative is that we prefer for black films just to be shown to black people, and they shouldn't have mass appeal and things like this. Firstly, I reject this false dichotomy, right? You do have films that are able to authentically represent black perspectives and things like this. We see films like Moonlight and Get Out. Sure, they have elements that appeal to, mass markets, but they have specific niche references that are also able to be picked up by members of specific communities. But secondly, just outweighing this, I think it's much more important to have widespread cultural recognition. The idea that black people can star in major films, and that it is much better for a black film to win an Oscar because it is able to reach more people, to motivate them to have role models to look up to, or even to recognize black people in positions of authority. We outweigh that here. So we've conclusively shown that we are able to change the academy and get the exact kind of change you need by drawing more attention. We win this debate because we are the side that gets Oscars and things like this. Let's talk about the second issue and why their boycott does not work. The idea we get from them is that you'll get this massive media attention, and the big push under this issue is that it is unprecedented. 2 lines of response here. Firstly, sure. But firstly, it's not that unprecedented, right? Boycotts have happened before. Boycotts have happened of, say, award ceremonies. That is a thing that's happened before. But also, boycotts have happened of sports events. Boycotts have happened of other things, right? The idea of, creators not interacting with an event isn't that novel. Secondly, okay, maybe it's somewhat unprecedented, but it's unprecedented the first year, right? Year 1, this happens, and then there's no people voting. That's maybe a new story, maybe gets some coverage. But I'm not convinced at all why in year 2, this is any more worthy of note than the fact that the Oscars voting board is 81% white. Why is this now a news story the second year? Why is it anything novel for the media to pick up with? I don't think they are able to successfully cultivate this kind of change over time and keep that media attention. And the key point here is their claim that we get from down the bench is that they have, this kind of media attention and media popularity because, they're successful filmmakers. But they fail to realize that successful filmmaker does not necessarily mean popular filmmaker. And yes, the examples we pointed out to were both successful and popular. That's because we know them. I don't know the successful filmmakers who aren't that popular because they're good at their craft, but they just appear in the credits somewhere, and they don't have that name recognition. That is the entire point. There are a subset of people who are very good at, say, editing a film or directing a film, but don't get the kind of media attention. These are a large segment of these successful black filmmakers, and means that they will never be able to create the kind of media coverage they need for a boycott. Right? Okay, but even if let's suppose they are able to get some media coverage and some ability the media is calling out and saying the Oscars is so bad in doing these things. How do they lead to change? The things we get from them is that they want sponsorships for black people, they want increased transparency, and increased quotas for black filmmakers. But I think I dealt with this in my introduction here, right? Increasing the transparency for Oscars is a massive, massive threat to the existing voting body of the Oscars. These people who have been on, as they say, for lifetime and get to vote and feel a sense of entitlement because they're the elite, they should be able to vote, and to reject this transparency. Quotas as well seem as very aggressive, and many people are anti-affirmative action because it seems seems unfair. Compare that to our side, where you have the more organic change of black filmmakers being able to start discussions, and yes, the tokenistic change of putting more black people on the academy, that is always much more palatable. That is a change we are able to get under side negative. That is why I'm so proud of those.
Thanks everyone for the round. I'll head outside and we'll come and get you when the results is ready.
Well done. Well done. Actually, the chair's good.
Yeah, good, interesting, cool. A few pieces of feedback, then the pool, then the explanation. The first piece of feedback is in relation to principles, which is I think that both teams need to do better at weighing their principle. I think the principles were actually relatively well explained in this debate, which I think is a bit of a rarity, particularly in art debates. But I think they need to be proven better as to why they're important in the round, why we should care about them more than practical impacts. The second thing, and this is specifically for the negative team, I think that you guys need to better explain what you're actually the negative team, this team. I think you need to explicitly explain, no, my God, my fucking feedback's for the affirmative, what you're propping. So the stuff in relation to transparency, you need to be like, here is specifically what our model would be from the start, and then whip that throughout all three speakers, because I think there were times in which I was confused which part of your model you were propping, because different things came in and out. It was like, we're going to make the barrier lower, and then we're going to do transparency. So I think you can pick a few, but I think defend them just a little bit better than you did. My third piece of feedback is I think that all teams could do better long-term impacting. So I think this debate had a bit of a short-term bias, whether it be about the media coverage or how people are going to perceive it. But let's think about how does this, if it does, change the academy in the long term. And I think that just means you can access an argument that I think is just better because you're able to extend it into the long term. The last thing that I think this debate was a bit under-exampled. Like I think we had like 2 examples of black filmmakers come out, which is like, I guess why the motion is set, right? Like there aren't enough. But I think that, you know, I guess just watch more black films maybe. I don't know. I feel like there could have been more examples, but that's okay. Okay, we marginally gave this debate to the negative team. I'm going to explain why, noting that it is extremely close. So, few questions. Firstly, on what is the existing change in the natural trajectory. Secondly, on what is the impact of media coverage. And finally, on the principle. Firstly, on the actually, I might go in reverse order and end with the largest theme. So firstly, on the principled obligation, what affirmative explains is that these black filmmakers have an obligation to future filmmakers to opt out of an institution which is inherently racist, and that the success of films is contingent on the academy, which means that they have an obligation to opt out of the thing that is being the most communicative to them. That's kind of the principled stance that gets pushed down throughout the bench. I think the problem with this principle is it's quite open to the attack which negative brings at second, which is that a useful analogy which elucidates the fact that just because there is racism or sexism in a sector, that doesn't give a specific individual the necessary obligation to fight for that particular cause. And I think the second way that negative can take this down is explain that the Oscars are so prestigious such that it's unfair that you have to opt out of any future accolades or awards that you could receive. So even if you've already been successful, you've spent your whole life working in X industry, this is the pinnacle of the industry, which both teams do agree on. And in that way, it's useful to be a part of the academy because you should also be recognised. And so you don't have that obligation ergo. So I think principled class is particularly important, but I think negative can explain 1, they don't have the specific obligation, but 2, they've overcome a lot in history at the point where they've finally made it into this field, which is so hard to get into. They all be recognised even if they've already been recognised. Okay, secondly, on existing change, noting this is where the crux of the debate occurs. So affirmative has 2 pushes from first. The first is that it's insufficient at the moment for a few reasons. Firstly, there's a high barrier to win. Secondly, things like lifelong membership mean that the white members outnumber the black members, obviously. Thirdly, that you're more likely to have connections and be accepted into prestigious institutions if you're white, and this is very well explained. And finally, that change is potentially superficial and tokenistic in the status quo. So you have like things like BLM happen and you have some changes, but that doesn't translate into long-term change. They explain that what this would mean is that you would get decisions becoming more transparent, you would have more sponsors, and it would change the way that the Oscars view art, like culturally, for example. Like if people opt out, it means that the Oscars are kind of, their hand is forced and they have to change the way in which their system operates, and there's an impact on society. I think this is all good. Integrating a piece of feedback, I do think you should be more specific about what you mean by the decisions are more transparent. So what does that actually look like in practice? I think would be useful. It doesn't weigh into my decision because that wasn't pointed out by the negative team, just FYI. Negative's substantive comes out twofold, and this is where the kind of responsive clash occurs. So the first thing negative says is that at the moment, the reason why it's useful to be an active member of the Academy as a black person is because the way that conversations happen are often informally. And so when you're a part of the Academy, it means you get access to, for example, networking opportunities and dinners or whatever. But also, there is just a level of cultural relevance about the Academy that makes it particularly important, and that if you opt out of it, you kind of opt out of all of the opportunities which the Academy provides. And even if the Academy is an imperfect body, which both teams recognise that it is, it's something that on net is still worth being a part of. The second thing they explain, and I think this is the weaker claim, is that the current trajectory is good, and that, you know, like there is kind of some recognition of talking about films in context and having lived experience, and that this means films are more in the conversation than they otherwise would be. Integrating a second piece of feedback, I don't think the trajectory is as good as you think it is. I think that's something that needs to be explained far better. That's what I would, one, point to more examples if you can, or two, just explain how, like, you know, the cultural zeitgeist outside of the film industry is forcing the Academy to be better, but again, it doesn't weigh into the OA. Affirmative has a few quite good responses to this. The first is that the stuff about networking conversations exists in the SQ, but percentages still aren't changing. Like, you still need 2 supporters, and because you're already in a minority statistically, it's hard to find those supporters, particularly when there's a disproportionate amount of white people. And the second thing they explain is that they want aggressive change on their side. The next claim from Affirmative in response, which is separate, is that people can still publicise and show their films outside of the Academy. And secondly, that the problem is that now black filmmakers, when they're in the Academy, have to kind of change their films to like whiteify them, because there's a different perception of what is aesthetic in the Academy versus what is aesthetic to black filmmakers. And it's the kind of weighing, I guess, that's given at third is that even if these films are less successful kind of with awards, that's okay, because at least they're kind of truer to themselves and they have more integrity. I think this weighing is tricky to win on, because I think Negative can correctly point out that maybe, but it is just better to get awards, because it means that your level of viewership is just highly likely to increase. Like, and I think pointing to examples of Moonlight and Parasite, I guess Parasite isn't black people but POC, like Moonlight I think is a better example, just wouldn't have gotten seen if they didn't get an Oscar. And I think they point to the fact that a lot of these films have very low commercial success, and it is like the delta is winning the Oscar or being nominated for the Oscar, because that kind of just forces producers and cinemas to show those films in a way that they otherwise wouldn't. So I think Negative, even though Negative has to cop the harm of, yes, the films have to be whiteified, and yes, they're probably slightly less authentic, I think that doing the weighing of reaching more people and explaining that because it's the biggest body, it gives them the biggest platform, I think that benefit is able to outweigh the benefit of being true and integral. Whilst I think that is important, I think Negative is able to do that weighing. The second reason why I think Negative is able to win this clash is because I think they're able to explain that being a part, like locking yourself out of the Academy, locks you out of a whole bunch of other opportunities that are just ingratiated within the Academy inherently. And I don't think that Affirmative is, that whilst you try, not able to do enough work to explain why those opportunities exist outside of the Academy. So whilst they obviously do, and you can create your own circles, I think Negative explains at third and at second that what you're able to do is have conversations also with white people that have power, and you're only kind of able to access that at the point where you're in the Academy. And because unfortunately these are the people that kind of pull the ropes, it is useful to be able to have those kind of connections and leverage them. So marginally, I think that's why Negative wins that clash. Finally, on media coverage, Affirmative's explanation is that you are able to get, this is like a kind of unprecedented move, and that because these people are very successful and recognised, that means that the media coverage is likely to be more permanent and create kind of industry lobbying, etc. Negative's response to this is to say that, well, people's response will, one, just be complaining about it, and two, like it's inherently short-termist. Things like boycotts have happened before, this is a short-term level of attention, but also there's a subset of people that are successful in the film industry, but not like kind of name recognised. However, I think affirmatives are able to explain that this is a relatively unique thing. Like, I don't think black filmmakers, well, I know they haven't, I wrote this fucking motion, like, they haven't opted out of the academy in the past, so this is something that would be relatively novel, and I think they're able to do a good job of explaining how, like, even if it is only a short-term public outcry, that probably is worthwhile, because even if you just have one prominent black filmmaker opting out, that likely will cause enough stir. This is where I think you guys could have done better long-term impacting, because that would have pushed that point even more, and I think an explanation of why this makes, like, maybe BAFTA or whatever, like, those groups bigger and the academy smaller and changes, like, the way the dichotomy works would be useful, but I don't think negatives mitigation on short-term is enough to be able to outweigh affirmatives material and how this is, one, unprecedented, and two, there are at least some people that have enough sway such that this would have an influence. So whilst I buy like negs material on that not everyone is well known, AF proves that enough well-known people would do it that it would be worthwhile. So I think AF is able to win on the media coverage argument. However, I think because, as I've already explained, one, on the principle, and two, on the fact that being a member of the academy is just super useful to your career, advancing yourself and other black people, that's why negative has won the round. I hope that makes sense. If it doesn't, please ask questions. Happy to provide individual feedback. But yeah, good job.